I went to Cornell from 1962 to 1966, and that was the period in American history where the civil rights movement was really hitting its most successful phase. So I was growing up. I was I was from 18 to 22 years old during those years, and I became very politicized around the civil rights movement. I had not really known New London as a place to grow up. There were hardly any African Americans, hardly any Puerto Ricans, as there are now in this city. It's because the demography of New London has changed a lot. So you have a lot of African Americans and a lot of Puerto Ricanos. But before I had gone to Cornell, I decided I wanted to take Spanish when I was in high school because it seemed much more practical to me that here we are in the Western Hemisphere, and you could see that Spanish was a language you were going to be able to use. So I was probably about my best subject in high school. I really worked at it. And when I got to Cornell, I continued taking courses in Spanish, and I made it a point to get involved with, I think it was called the Latin American Students Union. And they had sort of a social gathering, and they welcomed Anglos who were interested in speaking Spanish to come to those meetings. And that was something that was very significant to me in my later career choice, was the fact that I did develop a fairly good ability in Spanish. And combined with what, my interest in the civil rights movement, which was more academic than anything else when I was in college, I did write several papers involving civil rights issues, specifically around Saul Alinsky's organizing project, which was in Rochester, New York, another upstate New York location. He had gone in there and organized this African-American organization called Freedom, Integration, God, Hope, Today, the acronym being FIGHT. And it was something that started teaching me about organizing and the principles of organizing as set down by Alinsky, who, of course, later on was one of the influential people in training Chavez himself, and people in the Chicano movement who adopted a lot of those same tactics that were used in certain parts of the civil rights movement, and also then later on in the labor organizing in California. So all of that was important, but I wasn't directly involved in issues except as in sort of an academic way. When I got to law school in Virginia from 1966 to 1969, it was very easy to get involved because there were, first of all, as law students, we had a skill that we could use, and there were lots of civil rights organizing efforts going on in the South. And in Virginia, for example, I got involved in the fall of 1966 in a voter registration project. This was after the '65 Federal Civil Rights Voting Act had passed. And really, African Americans were voting in significant numbers in certain areas of rural Virginia for the first time. So that's when I was in law school, I became further politicized, I think you could say, in terms of saying, this is what I want to do with my life's work. I want to use the legal skills that I'm acquiring to further a struggle for justice. And so I was directly involved with those type of projects, and some things that were a little scary in Virginia. At the time, I went down by myself to one small town in Virginia during the 1966 election and was watching the poll activity there, where the blacks were really voting for the first time. And I think this was really unwise. The organization that we were working with, as I remember, was the NAACP, and they sent us out singly. They sent out law students all alone. So here I am, a white law student, down watching to make sure there's no incidents at these particular polling areas, and watching African Americans come in groups, usually in cars, and they would come in sort of caravans of cars, so that 10 or 12 people would go in to vote at the same time. And whites came up and were voting singly, and a couple of them harassed me a little bit, asked me what I was doing, asked me whether I was with the FBI, asked me what I was doing, and I gave them an explanation. I'm just here to see that everybody be able to exercise their right to vote. But it was kind of scary, because there was that undercurrent of violence that had certain taken place in other parts of the South, and this was a very small town with no institutions that were going to help you. So, but that was kind of the first thing I got involved in Virginia, and then I went on to be very active in what was called the Legal Aid Society, where we were directly providing legal assistance to low-income people, primarily African American, in 6 counties in central Virginia, around Charlottesville, and mostly in the area between Charlottesville and Richmond. There, Goochland, Louisa, Fluvanna County were 3 of the counties that were involved, and that taught me a lot. And I spent a lot of my time in law school changing the direction of the Legal Aid Society so that it was more oriented towards civil rights issues than like helping people get divorces and things like that. And then I applied for what was called the Reginald Heber Smith Fellowship, which was a national recruiting institution instituted by the Office of Economic Opportunity, which at that point had set up legal services programs. And because I spoke Spanish, I specifically asked to be assigned, after I was accepted with this fellowship program, to a program in southern Florida called South Florida Migrant Legal Services. And a very good friend of mine was working there, and he was very excited about the work they were doing. And the fellowship had a month of intensive training at the University of Pennsylvania Law School that sponsored it. And my friend called me while I was there and told me, you better not come, because the program is being busted by the governor of the state. There was a very conservative governor of Florida at that time named Claude Kirk, and he apparently had set out to basically destroy this program, which had been very effective in representing farm workers in central Florida. And I went to the director of the fellowship program, explained to him what I'd heard, and said, if that's the case, I don't want to go there, because we're going to wind up, my friend has told me the program is just going to be decimated in terms of its staff, and I'm going to go down there, I'm going to be a new lawyer with nobody to supervise me or teach me or anything else, and I don't think that makes any sense. So he said, let me check into it, and then a couple of days later he came back and said, well, we checked into it, and yes, that's exactly what's going on, and we'd like to send you someplace else. And so I was initially interested in going to California Rural Legal Assistance, CRLA, which was a very well-known program working with farm workers in California, but they already had a number of fellows assigned. And he said, why don't you go up to Seattle? Their legal services program there is getting good. We'd like to send another fellow there, and why don't you go on up there? So I did. And when I got here, I found out that in Washington State there was an area called the Yakima Valley that had a lot of Mexican Americans and a lot of Mexican American farm workers. And I did just a little bit of research on my own and found out that Washington State was in fact the 4th most significant state in terms of the employment of agricultural laborers. Primarily because of the labor-intensive quality of all of the crops that were raised here: tree fruits, hops, asparagus, At that point, sugar beets, although sugar beets went out of the Yakima Valley several years later. But so when I found that out, I went to the director of the program and said to him essentially, why don't I go over to the Yakima Valley and start making some contacts over there? There's no legal services program over there, and see if we could at least begin to get some involvement over there. And the director of the program approved it, essentially because although the program was oriented towards Seattle, King County, my salary was coming from a different source. It wasn't coming from the program's grant. And so the director of the program approved me going over there. And I then began to meet people like Tomas Villanueva, other people who were involved with the social agencies over there that were oriented towards the Mexican-American community. Eventually met Lupe Gamboa, who was going to law school at the UW at that time. And then when the strikes happened in September of 1970, I went over to the Yakima Valley and I got very involved in what eventually became the United Farm Workers movement in the Yakima Valley.